She took my sister's coin and vanished for a week. There's a word for what she is. Any decent soul here can guess it.
It carried far. She said Iris had taken her sister's coin for a dress that never came and disappeared with it for the better part of a week. She said a woman who traveled alone with a case of needles and thread was not a seamstress. She said there was a word for what Iris was, and it wasn't going to be spoken on the Lord's day, but that anyone standing there could guess it well enough on their own. Some people laughed. Not all of them, but enough that the sound settled in the air like dust that would take a while to come down. Iris stood with her case at her feet and did not move. She had a stillness about her that some read as guilt and others might have read as patience if they had been paying a different kind of attention. She was 26 years old, and she had heard this kind of thing before, in other towns, from other Ediths. She knew how to let it pass over her without catching. She kept her eyes on the far end of the street where the road bent down toward the river, and she did not look at any face in the crowd. Ethan Reed was leaning against the awning post outside the smithy. He watched. He was not a man who spoke into other people's business without cause, and he had not yet found his cause. He had a way of going very still himself, and the two of them, the woman by the store and the man by the post, were the stillest things in that noisy street. Then a scream came from the direction of the church. A woman was running toward the crowd, hatless, her skirt bundled up in one hand, and behind her another woman was carrying a child. The child was pale and slack, and the mother's face had the look people get when the ground has gone out from under them. She was shouting for the doctor. Someone told her Dr. Halloran had left 3 days ago for the fort and would not be back before the week's end. The child was 6 years old and her name was Ruth. She had eaten something in the churchyard. The mother did not know what. The child had been well an hour ago and now she was not. Ethan pushed off the post. He looked at the child and then he looked at Iris and said, "Do you know poisons?" It was not quite a question. Iris was already opening her case. They laid Ruth on the counter inside the general store because it was the nearest flat surface and it was clean. Iris called for warm water and mustard and any charcoal from the stove ground fine, and someone ran to fetch it. The mother stood at the child's head with her fists pressed to her mouth, and Ethan stood at the child's feet and did not speak and did not look away. Iris opened Ruth's mouth and looked, and then she felt along the small jaw and behind the ears and pressed lightly beneath the ribs. She was working fast, but nothing about her looked hurried. The mother watched her hands. What was near her in the churchyard, Iris said. Her voice was low and even, and it seemed to steady the mother the way a hand offered in the dark will steady a person who is falling. "There is a bush at the fence," the mother said. "Red berries. I told her not to go near it. I told her how many. I don't know, 2, maybe more." Iris nodded once and said the things she needed to say to the men in the room. Someone brought a bucket. Someone brought the mustard, still in its brown paper. Iris mixed a thing in a tin cup, tilted Ruth's chin up gentle as a mother turning a page, and got the child to swallow it, and then she turned her carefully onto her side. The whole store had gone silent enough that you could hear the fire working in the stove and the small cough of the child and the slow, dragging clock on the wall. Ruth's mother was crying without any sound at all, one hand at the child's hair. Iris did not look up. She was watching the child's color the way a person watches the horizon before weather. The color came back slow, the way color returns to a landscape after a storm has passed over it. Ruth stirred once, then twice, and made a small sound that was not a word but was enough to unlatch something in her mother's chest. The mother made a sound of her own then, ragged and wet, and pressed her forehead to the child's temple and stayed there. Iris did not step back. She stayed at the counter with her hand light on Ruth's wrist, feeling the pulse under her thumb the way a person feels for a thread in the dark, and only when she was satisfied did she straighten and roll her shoulders once and look at Ethan. "She'll need watching through the night," she said. "The worst is out of her, but her body will be tired for a day, maybe 2. Broth if she wants it. No solid food until tomorrow evening." The mother nodded at everything without hearing any of it because she was already back in the country where her child was alive. Ethan sent the men out with a look. He paid the storekeeper for the mustard and the tin cup and the cloth Iris had used, and he did it before anyone thought to charge her for it. Iris repacked her case with the same order she always used. Each small bottle and folded paper returned to its place. Ethan watched that too, the order of it. The way nothing was thrown in and nothing forgotten. Outside, the street had gone quiet in a way it had not been quiet before. People stood in loose groups and did not quite look at the store's door, and did not quite look away from it either. Edith was nowhere to be seen. The mother came out with Ruth wrapped against her shoulder and stopped in front of Iris and could not find any words at all. Iris put her hand briefly on the child's back and said, "Send for me if her breath changes." The mother nodded and went on. Ethan stood beside Iris on the boardwalk. The wind had come up off the river and was moving down the length of the street cold and steady, pulling at the eaves. "The boarding house is full," he said, in the tone of a man reporting weather. "Freight crew came in ahead of the storm and they'll be waiting it out 3-4 days. There's a cabin on my place, other side of the creek from the main house. Empty since my brother went west 2 years back. Wood stove, its own door. It's yours until the road clears or until you decide otherwise." He said it without ornament and without looking at her while he said it, which was its own kind of courtesy. Iris looked at him for a long moment. She had been offered rooms in towns before, and she had learned to hear the shape of what was being asked in return. There was no shape in this. It was a flat offer laid down like a plank across water. She said, "I don't want to bring you trouble. I've got an empty cabin," he said, "and I don't care what the town says." She picked up her case. The ranch was 3 miles out along the river road. They rode because Ethan had his horse at the rail, and he brought it around without discussion, and she put her foot in the stirrup and settled behind him with the case across her lap, and neither of them made anything of it. The wind was at their backs going out of town, and the sky was the color of pewter that had been left out in the weather, and the cold was coming down proper now off the hills to the north. A hawk lifted from a fence post as they went past and did not hurry about it. The cabin sat behind a stand of cottonwoods 100 yards from the main house, close enough to see the smoke of it, far enough to be its own place. Ethan opened the door and stood aside. The room was one room, and it was clean in the way a place is clean when someone has kept sweeping it out of habit long after the person it was kept for had gone. A cot, a stove, a table under the one window, a shelf with 2 books on it, and a lamp with oil in it. Iris set her case on the table with the care of someone setting down something they would need to find again in the dark. Ethan built the fire without asking. He crouched at the stove and did it the way he seemed to do most things, without wasted motion and without conversation about what he was doing, and when the draw caught and the wood took, he stood and brushed his hands on his trousers and looked around the room the way a man does when he is checking whether he has forgotten anything. "There's water in the pump out back," he said. "Kitchen at the main house if you want it, or don't. Whichever suits." She said thank you. He nodded and went out and pulled the door closed behind him. She stood a while in the middle of the small room and listened to the fire finding its rhythm. She had stood in 100 rooms like this one, and she had learned not to feel anything in particular about any of them, because feeling something was a way of asking to be disappointed. But this one had a window that framed the cottonwoods and the pale winter light coming through them, and someone had left the 2 books on the shelf as though for a person yet to arrive, and the fire in the stove had been built by a man who had not asked her for anything at all. She sat on the edge of the cot and put her hands flat on her knees and breathed once slow, and did not let herself think past the next hour. Word travels in a small town the way weather does, low and fast and ahead of itself. By the next afternoon people knew where Iris was staying, and by the day after that some of them had found reasons to come out along the river road. The first was Ruth's mother, bringing a folded quilt and a jar of preserves, and a look that could not quite hold Iris's eyes for shame at what had been said about her the week before. Iris took the jar and set it on the table and asked how the child was sleeping, and the mother sat in the one chair and cried a little, quietly, and Iris let her. After that they came, the way people come when they have decided a thing without having said it aloud. A woman with a swollen jaw and a tooth that had gone bad and needed pulling. An old man whose hands had begun to shake in the mornings and who was frightened of it in a way he could not admit to his sons. A young wife who had lost 2 bobbies and was carrying a third and could not sleep for the worry of it. Iris listened to each of them with her whole attention, which was a thing most of them had not been given in a long time. She was careful about what she said and careful about what she promised, and she did not make more of any of it than it was. She did not ask about payment. When people left small things on the table, a pat of butter, a length of ribbon, 3 eggs wrapped in a cloth, she thanked them and put the things away without remark. When they left nothing, she thanked them the same. Ethan observed all of it without commentary. He was at the main house or in the barn or out along the fence line most days, but he came past the cabin often enough to see who was coming and going, and he never asked and never lingered. In the evenings, sometimes, when the last of the visitors had gone and the light was leaving the cottonwoods, he would knock once on the door and stand on the step and say the kitchen had a stew on if she was hungry, and she would come. Sometimes she did not, and he would nod and go back across the yard, and there was no weight in it either way. The kitchen at the main house was larger than her whole cabin. There was a long table scored with the marks of years, and a stove that threw real heat, and a window that looked out toward the barn. He cooked plain and he cooked enough. She noticed, the first time she came, that there were 2 plates already set. She noticed, the second time, that he did not remark on her having come, only pushed the bread toward her. By the end of the second week, the ranch had found its rhythms without anyone arranging them. Ethan was up before light, and Iris rose not long after, and by the time he came in from the first round of the stock, there was coffee on the stove in the cabin or, more often now, in the main house, because she had begun to make her way across the yard in the dark rather than wait for him to knock. She did not announce this shift, and neither did he, but the coffee was on and a place was set, and it happened that way most mornings. One morning she was at the window with her cup when he came in stamping snow off his boots. He poured his coffee and sat, and they ate what was on the table without ceremony. After a while he said, "You sleep all right out there." She considered it honestly. "Better than I have in a long time." He nodded at his plate and did not pursue it, but something in the answer had registered, and she could see that it had. The weather turned harder in the third week. A storm came down out of the north over 2 days and buried the fence line and made the road into town near impossible. Iris watched from the cabin window as Ethan and a hired man moved between the barn and the pens, breaking ice on the troughs, forking hay out to cattle that stood shoulder to shoulder against the wind. When he came in at dusk, his eyebrows were white with frost and his hands were raw, and she set a bowl of hot water at the table without a word, and he sat and put his hands in it and did not thank her, because thanking her would have made it into more than it was. She had begun, without deciding to keep track of him. Whether he had eaten, whether the cough he had picked up from the cold weather had settled deeper, whether he was moving stiff in the shoulder he had hurt years back, that she had noticed him favoring one evening when he thought no one was watching. She did not say any of it to him, but she made Willow bark tea on the mornings his shoulder was bad, and she set it in front of him without explanation, and he drank it without asking what it was. On a Thursday evening he came in late, and supper was already on the table in the main house, and she was sitting with a book she had taken from his shelf, reading while she waited. He washed up at the basin and sat. "You didn't have to hold it," he said. "It keeps fine," she said, not looking up. He served himself and ate, and after a while she set the book aside and ate too, and the fire worked in the grate, and outside the wind had come up off the open country and was making itself known against the walls. After a while he said the north fence would need a full day's work before the next cold snap. She asked how long they had. He said maybe a week, if the weather held. She told him the old man with the shaking hands had come by that morning and seemed steadier, that she thought the tremor was more fear than sickness, and that talking to someone had done more for him than anything in her case. Ethan looked at her across the table. She looked back. Two people in a warm kitchen with the wind outside and supper between them, and nothing in particular being said, and it had the feel of something that had been going on long before it started. He looked back down at his plate. She picked up her book. The evening went on. It was one of those evenings when the sky above the ridge went the color of a bruise and the cold settled in properly. Ethan came around the side of the house and found her on the bench along the front wall, her hands in her lap and nothing in them, watching the last light leave the pasture. He sat down beside her. He had his coffee and she had hers, and for a while neither of them said anything. Then he said, "Where'd you learn it, the healing?" She looked at the pasture. "A woman named Hattie," she said, "in a place called Blackwood, 3 states east of here." He waited. He was good at waiting. It was one of the things she had noticed about him early, that he did not fill the space around a question the way most people did. "I was 14, she said. "My mother had died the winter before. My father was a man who drank. He had always been a man who drank, but after my mother went, there was nothing between him and it anymore. Hattie was the midwife in that town. She came by the house one day for reasons I never understood, and she saw how things were, and the next morning she came back and told my father she needed a girl to help her, and that she would take me on for room and board. She said it in a way that made it hard for him to refuse. He didn't refuse." She turned the cup in her hands. "She wasn't a warm woman. She didn't hold me or tell me it would be all right. She put a book in my hand the first night and told me to read it, and when I said I couldn't read very well, she taught me. She taught me everything. Herbs and how to set a bone and how to sit with a woman in labor for 30 hours without lying to her about how it was going. She taught me that the most important thing was not the medicine, it was the paying attention. She said most people were dying of not being paid attention to long before anything else got to them. The last color was leaving the sky. A horse shifted in the pen and blew out a long breath that hung in the cold air. She died when I was 22, Iris said. Left me her books and her case and the small amount of money she had put by. I stayed in that town a year after she went. Then something happened and I couldn't stay any longer, and I've been moving since." Ethan did not ask what had happened. He turned his cup in his hands and looked at the pasture, and after a moment he said, "Must get lonesome, town to town." She considered it honestly. "You stop noticing after a while," she said. "Or you think you do." He looked at her then, not quickly, not sideways. Directly and without apology, the way a man looks at something he has been trying to understand and has finally decided to look at straight. She held it without looking away. After a moment he looked back at the ridge. He stood and picked up both cups. "Cold's coming in," he said. She rose beside him and they went inside, and the door closed, and the night settled over the ranch. It was the 4th week when the rumor came. A man rode in from a town 2 days south, a drummer with a wagon of tinware and a mouth that had made him welcome in every saloon between here and the border. He was in the boarding house dining room within an hour of arriving, and by supper time the story was out. A woman had died, he said, in the town he had come from, a young mother, under the care of a woman who traveled with a case and no papers, a woman who called herself a healer but who had come and gone before anyone could ask her what she had done. He described her. He described the case. He described the way she wore her hair. Edith heard it before the sun set and made sure others heard it before the sun rose. By the next afternoon, when Iris walked into town for thread, she felt the shift the way a person feels the barometer drop before a storm. The women who had brought their children out the week before did not quite meet her eye. The old man who had come about his hands crossed to the other side of the street. The storekeeper served her without conversation, and the coins she laid down were taken up quickly, as though the touch of them might carry something. She bought her thread. She walked back to the ranch along the river road with her case in her hand, and the wind came off the water cold and steady, and she did not cry, because she had learned long ago that crying about it did no good and used up energy she was going to need for other things. Ethan heard it Friday morning at the feed store from 2 men who did not know he was standing behind the meal sacks. They were not being cruel about it, which was almost worse. They were talking the way men talk when they have decided a thing is probably true and are working out how to hold it. One said he had let his wife go out to the ranch about a matter he did not name, and he was wondering now if that had been wise. The other said a woman who moved that often had usually been asked to move. Ethan finished loading his wagon and paid what he owed and drove home at the pace he always drove. He unhitched the team and rubbed them down and forked hay and did the evening's work in its usual order. And then he split wood for a long while in the cold because there was more of it to split than he had any real need for. And finally he came inside. She was at the kitchen table with her case open in front of her, sorting through the small brown papers she kept her dried herbs in. She looked up when he came in, and then she looked at his face, and she set the paper in her hand carefully down on the table and folded her hands over it. "You've heard it," she said. "I've heard something." He hung his coat and poured himself coffee that had been on the stove too long and stood with his back to the counter, holding the cup in both hands. "There's a story going around," he said, "about a woman who died, down south." Iris looked at her hands on the table. "Her name was Anna Reyes," she said. "She was 20 years old, her first child. The baby was turned wrong and the labor had already been going a day and a half before anyone came to fetch me. I rode 4 hours in the dark to get there. By the time I walked in the door, I could see it in her color that we had almost no time. I tried to turn the baby. I tried everything Hattie ever taught me and 2 things I had thought of on my own since. The baby came out and did not breathe. Anna bled and I could not stop it, and she died holding my hand about an hour before dawn. Her husband was in the next room. He was 17 years old. I stayed until the sun was up and I told him what had happened, and I told him it was not his fault, and I told him it was not hers. And then I got on my horse and I rode out, because the town had already decided by the time the sun was up whose fault it had been, and I have learned that staying does not change what the town decides. It only gives them more time to do something about it." She was not crying. Her voice was very level. "I did not take her money," she said. "The husband tried to give me what they had, and I would not take it because there was nothing I had done that I could have charged him for. I have thought about her every day since. There are 3 or 4 I think about every day. Anna is the newest of them." Ethan stood at the counter for a long moment. Then he set his cup down and came over and pulled out the chair across from her and sat. "All right," he said. She looked up at him. "That's all," she said. "That's all," he said. "I've watched you work for a month. A woman who does what you did for that Ruth child is not a woman who kills mothers for money. I know what I've seen. The rest of it is what it is." She looked at him a long time. Her hands were still folded over the paper on the table, and he could see that they were not quite steady, though her voice had been. "They're going to say things," she said, "about you. For keeping me here. They've been saying things about me since I was 19 years old," he said. "I stopped listening around 22. It was one of the better decisions I've made." She almost smiled. It was a small thing and it did not last, but it was there. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers briefly and then took it back. The town did what towns do. For a week the road out to the ranch was empty of anyone who was not on ranch business, and Iris went about her work in the cabin as though she had never had a visitor at all. She reorganized her case. She copied out passages from Hattie's oldest book into a smaller one she could carry in her coat pocket. She mended a tear in her better dress. She kept her hands busy, because busy hands were an old habit and a useful one, and she did not let herself sit long enough at the window to count the empty road. Ethan did not speak of it. He came in for meals and he went out to the stock, and in the evenings he read by the fire or worked a length of harness at the kitchen table, and he did not ask her how she was, because he knew she would not have an answer he could do anything with. On the 9th day, the postmaster's boy rode out on a pony. He was a thin child of about 11, and he had ridden hard, and his face was red from the cold and from something else besides. He got down at the yard gate and pulled his cap off and stood holding it in both hands. "Ma'am," he said to Iris, who had come out on the step of the cabin at the sound of the pony, "it's my sister. She's burning up and Ma can't get her cool, and she said not to come get you, but Pa said—" His voice cracked. He steadied it. "Pa said please. He said please, ma'am." Iris was already reaching for her case. Ethan came out of the barn at the sound of the boy's voice and had the horse saddled in the time it took Iris to put her coat on. She rode behind him with her case across her lap the way she had that first day, and the boy rode ahead of them on the pony, looking back every minute or so to be sure they were still coming. The postmaster's house was on the near edge of town. Iris was inside within an hour of the boy's arrival. The child was 4 years old, and the fever had climbed high enough to worry any mother, but it had not yet climbed to the place where it did the harm Iris had seen it do in other children. She worked at bringing it down the slow way, cool cloths and small sips of a tea she made at the family stove, and she sat with the child through the night, and she did not leave the room until the fever broke a little after dawn. The postmaster stood at the door of the room when she came out. He was a small man with spectacles and a careful mustache, and he had been up all night in a chair in the hall, and he could not quite look at her. "Ma'am," he said, "about what has been said." "In the town. Your daughter is going to be all right," Iris said. "Keep her quiet today. She'll want to sleep. Let her." "Ma'am, you don't owe me anything," Iris said, gentler. "Not money and not the other thing. Go and sit with her." He went. Ethan was outside on the step with 2 cups of coffee that someone had given him. He handed her one. They stood together in the cold blue light and drank the coffee, and the town began to wake around them. Doors opening, smoke coming up out of chimneys, a dog barking somewhere down by the river. Word travels, as has been said. By the end of that day, the postmaster had told the story of the night to 4 people, and each of those 4 had told it to 2 or 3. And by the following morning the story of Anna Reyes had a companion in the air of the town, and companions matter. A story that stands alone can do more damage than a story that has to share the room with another. The women who had crossed the street the week before did not exactly recross it, but they did not cross away either. The old man with the shaking hands came out to the ranch on the 3rd day after. He said nothing about the week between his last visit and this one. He only sat down in the chair and put his hands on his knees, and Iris put her hand over his, and after a while the shaking eased. Word came through the postmaster near the end of the 6th week. Dr. Halloran had taken a position at a mining camp 200 miles west and would not be returning to the circuit. People stood around that news for a day or two, and then they got practical, the way people do when the alternative is going without. Quietly, without anyone deciding it, they began bringing things to Iris in a way that had a different weight than before. It was no longer, "We will come to you until the doctor gets back." It was, "We will come to you." A broken wrist set and splinted, a gash on a woodcutter's leg that needed cleaning and stitching, a woman in her 7th month who had been spotting blood and did not know whether to be frightened. Iris took each of them the way she had always taken them, one at a time, without making more of it than it was. When a night call came, Ethan rode out with her. He did not announce this as a decision. The first time it happened, he simply had the horse ready at the yard when she came out with her case, and she looked at him and put her foot in the stirrup, and they went. He waited outside in the cold while she worked, and when she came out, he was still there. They rode back in the dark without discussion. It happened that way every time after. Edith kept her distance until the night her sister took a fall on the ice outside the church and could not be moved. Edith came herself, on foot, in a shawl that was not enough for the weather. She stood at the door of the cabin and did not knock, only stood there, and Iris opened the door and looked at her and said, "Let me get my case." Iris worked on the sister at her own kitchen with 2 lamps burning and Edith at the head of the table holding her hand. The hip was not broken, which was the good news. The shoulder was out of the joint, which was less good but fixable. Iris put it back the way Hattie had taught her, quickly and with as little talk as possible, and the sister made a sound and then went quiet, and Edith made a sound of her own, and Iris said, "She'll be sore for a week. Someone will need to help her dress." "I will," Edith said. It was the first word she had spoken since she had come to the door. Iris packed her case. Edith walked her out onto the step. In the cold, in the dark, with Ethan waiting at the gate with the horses, Edith said, "I said things." "I know," Iris said. "I don't take them back," Edith said, "because that isn't how it works, but I will not say them again." "That's enough," Iris said, and it was. It had been a hard week. A birth 2 nights running and a boy with a fever between them, and Iris had come home both mornings gray with tiredness. Ethan had said nothing, only left things where she would find them. Coffee on the mornings, a plate kept back at night. The fire built up in the cabin before she got there, though he did not admit to that and she did not ask. On the Friday, she came in from the last of it before dark and sat in the chair nearest the fire in the main house and did not reach for anything. He came in from the stock and found her there. He sat in the other chair and worked a length of leather, and the fire did what fires do, and the house settled around them the way a house settles when the people inside it have stopped moving. After a while, her eyes closed. He went on with the leather. When he added a log and settled back, she had drifted toward him, her head coming to rest against his shoulder with the slow ease of someone who had given up the last of their waking self. He went still. He set the leather on the arm of the chair. The fire worked. The wind pressed at the windows. He sat with her weight against his shoulder, and he knew what this was. He had known for some time. He woke deep in the night with the fire burned to coals and her breath slow and even against his collar. He got up carefully and built the fire back and found a blanket from the chest by the wall. He settled the blanket over her and stood a moment looking at her face, which in sleep had let go of its watchfulness and was simply a face. It was a good one. He put his coat on and went out before the light came, because he wanted her to wake without an audience and figure out for herself what she wanted to do about the fact that she had slept the night in his kitchen. She woke late with the fire warm and the blanket around her. She looked at the other chair, and the piece of leather on its arm, and the fire that someone had tended, and she did not move for a long time. Outside, the sun had come up over the ridge, and the yard was bright with new snow, and the tracks of Ethan's boots led out across it toward the barn. The last of the beef cattle came down out of the high pasture on a Saturday, which meant the winter dance in the hall that night, which was the custom in that valley. Lanterns strung along the beams. 2 fiddles and a man with a squeeze box, tables of food brought by every household. The men in from the hills with the looseness of people who had finished a hard thing and were ready to set it down. Iris went because Ethan was going. She wore her better dress, the one she had mended, and she stood where the lamplight reached but did not insist, at the edge of things, the way she had always stood in town after town, present without being seen. Ethan came and stood beside her. He had washed and put on a clean shirt, and his hair was still damp at the collar, and he looked younger than he did in the yard and older than he did at the kitchen table. He was quiet a while, watching the dancers. Then the fiddle slowed and the room reorganized itself, and he looked at her. "Dance with me." She looked at the floor and at the people already watching from the corners of their eyes. She handed him her cup. He set both cups on the nearest table and offered his hand, and she took it, and they walked out into the lamplight. He was not a graceful man, but he was steady, which in a partner is worth considerably more, and she found the rhythm of him quickly. His hand was at her waist and her hand was in his, and he was looking at her, not at the crowd, not past her shoulder at her, with an expression that was plain and certain and had been a long time arriving. The song ended. Neither of them stepped back. The fiddle started something livelier. Ethan looked down at her. "Walk with me." They left the light and went out into the street, and the cold hit them clean after the warmth of the hall. The music went distant behind them. They walked to the end of the street where the boardwalk gave out to the river road, and Ethan stopped and looked out at the dark water moving slow between its banks of ice, and she could see him arranging something, a careful man putting words in the right order because he intended to say a thing only once. "The town knows it now," he said. "They need what you do." A pause. "I need what you do, too," he said. "Not the medicine, I mean the rest of it. The way you sit down at the table, the way the coffee is on, the way I know where you are in a day." He looked at her. "I've been alone a long time," he said. "Longer than I meant to be. I stopped counting on anything different a while back. Then you came and I started counting again without meaning to. I'm asking you to stay, permanent, as my wife if that is what you would want. Not on account of the cabin and not on account of practicality. I want that to be clear." It was clear. It had been clear, and the coffee left without comment, and the fire built up before dawn, and the blanket laid over her by hands that had tried not to wake her, and the horse waiting outside every house she had been called to in the cold. It had been clear on the bench in the fading light when he asked where she had learned what she knew, the first time she could remember that anyone had wanted to know something about her that was not written in the contents of her case. Her hand found his at his side. She put it there against his, warm in the cold air. "Yes," she said, "that's what I want." He turned his hand and closed it around hers, and they stood at the end of the street with the river moving dark below them and the music going on faintly behind, and neither of them was in any hurry to go back. They were married 4 weeks later in the small church at the top of the street. The sky was the pale, flat gray of late winter, and someone had tied sprigs of cedar to the door because the pine had gone by. The minister was brief because Ethan had asked him to be. More people came than either of them had expected. Ruth was there in a blue dress that had been let down at the hem, and she stood at the front with her mother and did not take her eyes off Iris the whole way through. The postmaster came with his wife and the daughter whose fever had broken at dawn, and Edith came with her sister on her arm, the sister still a little stiff in the shoulder but walking. The old man with the shaking hand stood at the back and held his hat over his heart the whole time. Iris carried her case to the church. At the threshold, she set it down on the step and went inside without it. The people who saw said nothing, which was the right way to receive it. When it was done, they came out into the cold afternoon, and Ethan's hand was at the small of her back, not gripping, just present in the way of something that had decided where it belonged. They walked back along the river road toward the ranch in the early dark. The road was the same road. The cold was the same cold. Behind them, the town settled into its evening, smoke from the chimneys, lamplight finding the windows one by one. Come spring, the case hung on a hook by the door of a small room at the front of the main house, a room Ethan had built out and fitted with a proper door, and a shelf and a bench under the window where people could sit while they waited. Edith passed the ranch sometimes on her way to visit a cousin farther down the road, and she stopped in once or twice with a jar of something or a piece of news, and she did not look sideways anymore, which was as close to an apology as the town was going to get from her, and it was enough. Iris worked and Ethan worked, and the seasons moved through the pasture and the long road into town, and on quiet afternoons in that small front room, with the door propped open to the breeze, you could sometimes hear the cattle down at the river and the wind coming through the cottonwoods, and it was a good sound to work to. A year in, the young wife who had lost 2 bobbies and had come to Iris frightened in the first weeks brought a healthy boy to term. She named him for her grandfather, but she asked Iris to hold him first before the grandfather did, and Iris held him in the small front room with the spring light on the floor, and she did not cry, but Ethan, who was standing in the doorway, saw her face and had to look away for a moment. 2 years in, a girl of their own. They named her Hattie, after the woman in Blackwood who had put a book in a 14-year-old's hand and taught her to read it. She had her father's steadiness and her mother's hands, and she followed Iris around the front room from the time she could walk, and by the time she was 5, she knew the smell of every jar on the shelf. That was the story of Iris and Ethan, a woman who had been called a liar in one town and a healer in another, and had learned not to expect either word to hold. A man who had an empty cabin and did not care what the town said. A cold winter that turned into a spring, and a spring into a life, and a life that was, in the end, the ordinary miracle of 2 people who had decided to stop moving past each other and stay. Let me know what you thought of this one. Thank you.